Hello, welcome to another episode of the Daily Seeds of Flourishing. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Queen's A Night at the Opera from a particular angle where I feel it's important for my particular flourishing. But before I do that, I just want to do like I do in most episodes, is like set this up. Like, why was I thinking about Queen's A Night at the Opera today? So I was out on my usual my morning constitutional, and at the moment for the past seemingly 2 or 3 months, probably longer, they've been upgrading the road around where I live, and they've finally got round to resurfacing it. And so there's a lot of stuff out there. It's been noisy on and off for quite a while. So this morning it's particularly noisy because of all the trucks involved in actually laying the final surface of the road down. So I put on a playlist. Specifically, I put on RJ's Epic Awesome playlist, which is a playlist I've been working on for the last probably, this would have been pre-COVID, so last 2 to 3 years. It's now up to 3,188 songs. I worked out this morning, it showed it on my iPad better than it does here, that it was something in the region of 240 hours, I think it is. So it would take me 10 days to listen to this. Obviously it's a playlist to listen to on shuffle, as there's quite a bit of clustering goes on as I add stuff as a result of me putting together my music podcast, and which only when I go through and systematically listen to albums and I think, that track belongs on my Epic Awesome playlist, so it's always added to. I've got to add some other 50s stuff. I think this week I've been listening to some early 50s stuff because I was trying to make a decision about a particular piece of vinyl that I wanted to buy from that time period. So I'm sure there's going to be some more 50s stuff being added to this. As I mentioned, I will post a link to this in the description, and therefore anybody that's interested who's got Spotify and wants to check it out and listen to it, they can. So I'm listening through to this, and obviously when you're listening to something as diverse as this, I started thinking about particular albums that have a high level of diversity, and even more specifically, the first album I listened to where that became really apparent, and I was totally blown away by the variety of styles, music, formats that the band could play, and also just the sheer musicianship on offer. And for me, that was Queen's A Night at the Opera. Now obviously it's going to be different for different people. When I try and rationalise this and work out why that might be the case, I was born in the mid-60s. By the time this came out, I would have been around 11, 12. So, or the time I got to listen to it, and listening to it all the way through at a friend's house. It fits exactly. There were probably other bands and albums that may have also fit the bill, but it was just this album at that time that just blew me away and made me appreciate what a band was capable of in terms of their musical diversity, their musical skill, the range of instruments that they were able to utilise or sound like they were utilising. And so this was the album that did it for me. And again, what I'm specifically talking about here is that diversity in a single album. I'm not necessarily talking about, say, where a band might have created or been part of creating a particular genre. In the case of, say, Amoebic's Arise album, which you could say launched the British crust punk scene, along with bands like Antisect, or albums where a band took a complete pivot, so much so they probably alienated a large proportion of their fan base, and this might be illustrated in the case of My Dying Bride's 34.788% complete. Although, there is quite a bit of musical diversity on this album, but I feel it's more of a pivot album. So what I'm specifically talking about is, an album where that musical diversity was within the single album and wasn't a case of a band maybe slowly presenting that over time. And it's always interesting, just for me anyway, to look at, say, sites like Best Albums and Album of the Year, and also Best Ever Albums, and just think about, supposing I had been born in the 50s and using the same process of saying, well, it would probably be a band in the following decade. Like, what album may have I had the same experience of? So, if I was, say, born, say, in the 50s, then quite possibly that's going to be, say, a Beatles album, or maybe a Beach Boys album, something like that. If I was born, say, skipping over, well, let's just look back at the 70s to look at some alternates. Obviously, David Bowie springs to mind, but again with him, you could argue over a series of albums, but there probably was certain albums where they were quite musically diverse. I'm thinking of the Berlin Trilogy period. But again, I'm sure there's bands apart from Queen that I could highlight up, which may on a single album have that musical diversity. And then if I was moved through to, say, had I been born in the 70s, and again I'd come to be about 10 or 12 in the 80s, then that could well be something like Prince's Sign of the Times. For musical diversity. Again, we've got other albums like, say, the Joshua Tree, but there's also bands that maybe either pivoted more on an album, like, say, Talk Talk with Spirit of Eden, or their album was part of a slow progression over time. And I often find actually that a better site for doing this sometimes is Best Ever Albums, because they have these summary areas in here, so it often gives you a bit of a better overview when you're trying to do that sort of thing. And you could go on, supposing you were born in the 80s, would that have been, say, certain albums by Depeche Mode, although the band that might spring to mind more is Radiohead, certain albums by them that have a high degree of musical diversity on them. But they're an interesting band because they do straddle quite a number of decades in terms of albums where you might be able to say that. So if we move on to the 2000s and look again here, and the sort of artists that tend to come up in terms of their albums, like Best Ofs, and then so on moving forward. So, with the 2020s, maybe you were born in the 2010s, and you're now starting to notice certain albums that are just blowing your mind with their musical diversity. So yeah, that's what really today's episode is about, is albums that really aid through your flourishing through just when you experience them for the first time end to end, how they just make you aware of what bands or artists are capable of musically when they're in their own, fluidity or flourishing, whatever term you want to use, and how that might inspire you in a number of different aspects. So for me, the first time that I'm aware of that happening would be Queen's A Night of the Opera. Obviously, subsequently, it's happened with other albums. And as I've said, there might be other ways of looking at this, like albums that, launched a whole genre, or bands where there was a progressive change over time, or bands that completely pivoted, either for good or bad, depending on how various fans look at it. So hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Has made you think about something from a flourishing perspective. And if you happen to be on Spotify, and you have time, then take time to enjoy my epic awesome playlist. Thanks once again for listening. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.